Good evening and welcome to the Hal Lindsey Report. Tonight, we're going to re-examine an organization that I believe has greatly contributed to the economic decline and possible collapse of the United States as we know it. This report has a great bearing upon the fulfillment of Bible prophecy for the last days. The organization we examine tonight could be one of the major causes of the collapse of the United States as a world power. And when this is connected with the rapid economic decline of the European Union, I see the conditions ripening for the Antichrist to step in and create a new world order with a one world government headed by him. Events are all coming together to indicate time is short. So listen carefully. Recently, the Federal Reserve held a centennial anniversary of the Jekyll Island meeting that created the Federal Reserve System in 1913. In celebrating its centenary of the 1910 Jekyll Island meeting that resulted in draft legislation for the creation of a U.S. central bank, it held a two-day conference to discuss, 1, the origins of the Fed, 2, how closely the Fed has followed its original mandate, and 3, what its track record teaches us about its role going forward. In a hat tip to its conspiratorial foundation, the Atlanta Fed's website admits that the Jekyll Island meeting in November 1910 was secretly planned by Senator Nelson Aldrich, the chairman of the National Banking Commission. Over the years, the clandestine nature of the meeting has been criticized as allowing undue Wall Street influence over the founding of the U.S. Central Bank. However, the meeting itself was just one step in the process that led to the creation of the Federal Reserve. That first step was taken in November 1910 when an alliance of wealthy bankers pretended to go duck hunting on a private estate on Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. Together, the group represented about 1/6 of the world's wealth at that time. They met in secret because if word had gotten out about what they had in mind, the public would have never stood still for it. Indeed, the Federal Reserve Act was itself passed in complete secrecy. 2 days before Christmas in 1913, most lawmakers were aboard trains headed home for the holidays. The U.S. House of Representatives voted on the Federal Reserve Act on December 22, 1913. It was ratified by the Senate the next day. Just enough lawmakers stayed behind in Washington to ensure the act would pass unopposed. There are those who call the Federal Reserve a conspiracy. You know, if the word conspiracy is to have any meaning at all, then they are right. The Jekyll Island bankers conspired to create the first central bank since Andrew Jackson vetoed the Second Bank of the United States in 1832. Why is that a big deal? Because the Federal Reserve represents the most massive fraud in the history of the world. Because of its name, most Americans believe the Federal Reserve is an arm of the United States government. The Federal Reserve is no more federal than Federal Express. In 1982, in a case called Lewis versus the United States, the Ninth Federal Circuit Court ruled, "We conclude that the Federal Reserve banks are not federal, but are independent, privately owned, and locally controlled organizations." When Andrew Jackson vetoed the Second Bank of the United States charter in 1832, he said this about central banking: "Controlling our currency, receiving our public monies, and holding thousands of our citizens in dependence, it would be more formidable and dangerous than the naval and military power of the enemy." In 1933, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt wrote in a letter to Colonel Edward Mandell House, "The real truth of the matter is, and you and I know, that a financial element in the large centers has owned the government of the U.S. since the days of Andrew Jackson. History depicts Andrew Jackson as the last truly honorable and incorruptible American president. What an amazing admission. Something else amazing about Andrew Jackson. Jackson was elected in 1832 on the slogan, "Jackson and no bank." The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 created the largest centrally controlled money trust on the face of the earth. Evidence suggests that the Federal Reserve engineered the Great Depression, and its policies prolonged it until most of the wealth was concentrated in the hands of a select few millionaires who came out of the other side as the world's first billionaires. The Fed is a private corporation that is not part of the U.S. government, but is wholly owned by the banks. The Secretary of the Treasury is and has been a trustee of America's creditors since the passage of the Banking Act of 1933. The Banking Act of 1933 was the point at which America defaulted on its debt, forcing the confiscation of all private gold, which was then used to satisfy selected creditors. All members of the money trust, most of the gold ended up in the vaults of the money trust European banks. It sounds like crazy talk. How could such an obvious and shameless theft not only go unpunished, but be celebrated 100 years later as an example of farsighted statesmanship? It couldn't be true, could it? 100 years later, the exact same scam is being perpetrated by many of the exact same players. The list of recipients of funds from the Troubled Asset Relief Program, known as TARP, reads like a list of the banking families that met in secret on Jekyll Island in 1910. Schiff, Warburg, Morgan, Stanley, Lehman, Rockefeller. The only things that have changed are their clothes and their hairstyle. The money trust really does exist, and it really does dictate the terms under which the economy is permitted to operate. The money trust isn't even a conspiracy anymore. It's gone way beyond that. It's a completed system, first constructed in Europe over a period of hundreds of years, upon which we now depend for our continued existence as we know it. I'll be back in a moment.